It started. The war.
Fire! Fire!
What this mean for you?
Fire!
Don't know yet. We pray and we wait. It was April 12th, 1861. The war began in Charleston Harbor. Cannon fire tore through the darkness as Confederate guns opened on Fort Sumter. The sky flashed and the water shook. Charleston woke to the sound of history breaking open. For South Carolina leaders, it was the birth of a rebellion. For the enslaved, who made up most of the city, it sounded like something else. Robert Smalls stood near a window, listening. He knew this harbor, its tides, its signals, and the way ships moved through it. Hannah, his wife, also saw the distant flashes from the second floor of their humble home above a barn. They understood this war would not stay at the forts. It would move through the water, into the streets, and into their lives. South Carolina called it independence, but to those held in bondage, it sounded like a thin line of light cutting through the darkness. Smalls looked outward toward the ships resting in the harbor, and as the cannons faded into the early morning, one question remained. What would he do first? Robert Smalls came to Charleston after being born and raised enslaved in Beaufort, South Carolina. As a teenager, he was sent north to the city, a place where wealth moved through the harbor and power rested on human bondage. Smalls worked in the docks, and he got good at it.
Watch that rope, boy!
He loaded ships, unloaded cargo, watched who came and went, and quietly, he learned how the city truly functioned. In his 20s, he married Hannah Jones, an enslaved hotel housekeeper 5 years his senior. Hannah understood Charleston as well as he did, its dangers and its limits. Together they planned not for survival, but for release. While others labored only to endure, Smalls found ways to earn money of his own. He bought produce grown by other enslaved people and sold it to sailors arriving from distant ports. Every coin mattered.
We making progress. We almost halfway there.
Robert and Hannah lived together in 2 small rooms above a stable near the market, a rare independence for people still owned by others. At night, they counted what they saved. Their goal was $800, the price demanded for Hannah's freedom and for their children. Freedom was not a wish, it was a calculation, and every calculation has a breaking point.
You do a good job driving the ship there, Robert.
By the time the war reached Charleston streets, Robert Smalls had already found his opening. It came in the form of a ship called the Planter. According to the U.S. National Park Service, the Planter was not a warship. It was a 147-foot side-wheel steamer. It was used as a Confederate Army dispatch and transportation vessel, used to carry cargo, supplies, and men throughout Charleston Harbor and beyond. And Smalls knew it well. He worked aboard her daily, learning her routes, her timing, the narrow channels, and the shallow water that shaped every movement throughout the harbor. But Smalls wasn't only studying the ship. He was studying the men who commanded her. He watched the captain closely, the wide-brimmed hat, the way he walked the deck, his gait, and his posture, the nods and hand signals exchanged with passing boats, the sharp blasts of the whistle used to speak across the water without words. Smalls learned where ships slowed, where they stopped and where they were searched, and where they were simply waved through. He became friendly with the white sailors aboard, entertaining them by mimicking the captain's walk across the deck.
Ha! You look just like the captain.
But for Smalls, it wasn't just entertainment. It was strategic practice. Each night, the white officers left the ship to sleep on shore. Smalls and the other enslaved men were left behind. With each sunset, Smalls was watching, listening, and memorizing. To the men who commanded him, the Planter was a tool. To Robert Smalls, it became something else entirely. It was a map and test run for the future no one was meant to imagine. The war had changed Charleston Harbor, but Smalls had already learned how it worked, and he had a plan just how to leave it. Robert Smalls didn't speak openly. He couldn't afford to. Historical accounts suggest because he was a mulatto, his owner had given him the privilege of earning some of his own money while being essentially hired out. Even with this small privilege, he spoke carefully and only when he was sure. He spoke with some of the enslaved men who worked beside him on the planter. They included Alfred Smalls, his brother-in-law, Abraham Smalls, identified as his cousin, and Samuel Pitcher, an experienced pilot familiar with Charleston Harbor. The others included men who had wives and children living under the same threat he did. He couldn't speak openly about this because it would mean death for all of them, so each conversation was measured.
If a morning came before the sun was up, and I told you to bring your woman and your child, would you be ready?
The man didn't answer right away. "You say it's time, we come." Smalls quietly acknowledged his response. Nothing more needs to be said. The plan didn't require speeches, it required certainty. But the hardest conversation was still ahead. That night, in the narrow rooms above a stable near Charleston's market, Smalls finally told Hannah what he had been carrying out alone. Smalls laid out the risks, the danger, the secrecy, and the understanding that once they moved, there would be no turning back. Hannah listened, at first stunned. Then Hannah did something else. She steadied herself, and then she spoke. "It is a risk, but you and I, and our little ones, we must be free. Where you die, I will die." Smalls did not know when the opportunity would come, only that it would. The officers left the planter every night. The harbor followed its routines, and the war tightened its grip on the city. And Smalls waited, not for chaos, but for the one moment when preparation would meet opportunity. When that moment came, there would be no turning back. On the evening of May 12, 1862, the harbor was quiet. The city dimmed. Nothing appeared different. Before leaving for the night, the captain granted a small request. The crew's families were allowed to visit, briefly, as long as they were gone before curfew. The captain had done this many times before. It was permitted, it was routine, and it gave Robert Smalls the opening he had been waiting for. For many, this was the moment they understood there would be no turning back. Historical accounts tell us some of the women cried out in fear. The men tried to calm them, not with promises, but with urgency. Smalls said very little. There were no speeches to give, only a choice to make. The men had prepared for weeks. They had gathered ammunitions and supplies, and if discovered, they were prepared to destroy the ship rather than be taken alive. At around 3 a.m., the planter eased away from the dock, moving as it had done countless times before. What made this morning different was not the ship. It was who stood at her helm. Robert Smalls stepped into the captain's place, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and long coat he had watched night after night. He knew one mistake could cost the life of everyone on board, so he did what he had always done. He appeared ordinary. Smalls stood where the captain always stood, waited the same amount of time, issued the same commands. Charleston Harbor was lined with checkpoints, each one designed to stop the unfamiliar. Hesitation would invite inspection. Inspection would mean death. When the moment came, Smalls sounded the whistle. The signal was returned. One checkpoint passed, then another. Below deck, families waited in silence. As the planter approached Fort Sumter, the fortress whose guns had opened the war, the tension sharpened. This time, the cannons didn't fire. The planter passed through, and with the open water ahead, Robert Smalls knew there was no room for delay.
Take that flag down. Raise the white sheet. Now.
The Confederate flag came down. A white sheet was raised in its place, but surrender only mattered if it was seen.
"Captain, a ship approaching fast."
All hands, prepare the guns and stand by.
As one eyewitness later recalled, just as the guns were being raised, a voice shouted, "I see something. It looks like a white flag."
Hold.
Stand by.
The Planter had never sailed this far into open water. The engine strained. Everyone knew the danger wasn't over. Robert heard the captain say to stop the boat or he would open fire.
Shut the engines down.
Smalls brought the ship alongside the Union blockade vessel and called out.
Good morning, sir. I brought you some of the old United States guns.
In addition to its crew and their families, the Planter carried artillery, ammunition, and the captain's Confederate signal book, including maps and mines hidden throughout Charleston Harbor. The crew and their families were free, and the impact of that morning did not stop there. Small's escape helped convince Union leaders that black men would fight and die for freedom. Smalls later helped recruit thousands. By the war's end, nearly 170,000 black soldiers had joined the Union Army, and 19,000 served in the Navy. One act of courage did not end slavery, but it helped change the course of a war.